from Galway, where he set up 126, a non-profit space. Niall is a recent graduate of the MA Oral Visual Cultures program. So welcome Niall, and a clapping for Ali.
Hi everybody. Just before I start, I just want to say thanks very much to everyone for coming as well, and also, like Lawrence said earlier on, I want to thank in a major way the staff and faculty at the Rietveld Academy for organising this really interesting conference. I was kind of excited to come here, having read the list of participants, but I've been really pleasantly surprised to find out just how interesting all these intersections promise to be as well. So it's been really fun to meet all the different participants, and I hope I'll get a chance to speak to some of you guys as well before I go back. And also a big thanks to Lawrence as well for curating this event. So as you can see from the title of my talk today is 88 to 94, Silence, Censorship and the Broadcasting Ban. So the broadcasting ban that I'm talking about in this particular instance is one that took place in Northern Ireland and the UK from those years, from 88 to 94. What I want to approach with this talk is give a little bit of historical background, but I won't expect that everyone will be able to follow the thrust and match it to historical events, but I will drop in bits of information that are necessary. So another thing that we need to know about the broadcast ban is that it affected 11 different groups, which spanned Republican organisations, which were trying to achieve a united Ireland, and also loyalist ones, which wanted to remain part of the UK. This is an outline to the historical context, but I think what I really want to emphasize with this talk is how these distinct separate elements of silence, censorship and the voice, which became a highly politicized, and public speech as well, a highly politicized notion during this period. So what I really want to get at is how these elements of silence, censorship and the voice influence each other and overlap and impress upon each other under the conditions of the broadcast ban. So under those conditions, that takes in those dates from 1988 to 1994. So as a 6-year span, this was active in the UK and Northern Ireland. All the examples of audiovisual material that's been broadcast over TV has fallen and was broadcast within this time frame. So that's another important point to note. So what I want to outline then is that maybe we can think of this particular period of censorship as a kind of silence in itself, when certain voices and political opinions were excluded from the airwaves and political discourse in general was restricted. So the thing about a period of censorship like this as well is that it requires us to have a more attentive form of listening. So in order to pick out the sounds and the voices and the different anomalies that the legal structure of the ban brings about, and these occur on these fringes and thresholds, and these define the limits and the effectiveness of the ban. An important point to note about this ban as well is that it has a certain limit, not just temporally, but also as an idea of a jurisdiction. So obviously it has an effect in Northern Ireland, but in the UK as well, and it kind of bleeds over into all the areas that these TV channels could reach. So this jurisdiction is an extensive thing, so it's a physical space, but the censorship also has an intensive dimension, and that's like a more elusive object to try and apprehend, but it's a bit more tangible when we consider this intensive aspect as another kind of voice, but a silent voice, but a very insistent voice that kind of permeates throughout all of this, which is the silent voice of the letter of the law. So at each kind of, every time Northern Ireland came up on the airwaves during this time, this silent voice kind of called for an interpretation, and every news item that was produced within this thing had to be kind of referenced and filtered through this. So as censorship kind of affects the range of our audition, it can be thought of as a shifting topology, which is my starting point for dealing with this topic. Because I'm dealing with a few different moving parts here, I think that it might be useful to kind of outline some of the conceptual frameworks that I've been using as a guide, which also might help to kind of anchor and situate some of the things I'm talking about. So I noticed from your website as well that Mladen Dolar keeps popping up, which is great because I share an enthusiasm for his work. I think it's an amazing resource when you're trying to think about the voice as an object for thought. So he kind of manages to outline how the voice intersects at these kind of ambiguous and paradoxical topological points where voice kind of interacts between the body and language, between subject and otherness, without really belonging to either. He also has an uncanny knack of enfolding these kind of topological points within kind of dense rhetorical statements. So I'm thinking of a passage in his essay, The Linguistics of the Voice, where he says, when we speak in order to say something, the voice is the part which cannot be said. So I kind of try to use that as a guide when kind of constructing this talk and my approach with this topic as well. So there's kind of these elusive contours which exist, and they're kind of hard to define, but they kind of wind their way into our auditory range, but they might not always be embodied in a speaking subject. So there's a different kind of a setup where there's different kind of voices that are competing in this space. So that leads me to the next thinker, which I think is really useful. I don't know if you've come across him over the course of the year, but his name is Goodman, and he has come up with another way of kind of bypassing the more traditional methods of thinking of sound as a dialectic between noise and silence. The way he does this is he kind of outlines instead a kind of more open field where the dialectic is missing, but we have instead a movement of vibration across what he calls a micropolitics of frequency. Now, this is a complicated slide, it's a bit busy, but if the one thing I want to point out really is this middle section here, kind of at the lower end, this defines our audible threshold. And if all around this, the different scales, there's aspects of sounds that we are not necessarily aware of, but they impact upon us and the body as well through a kind of resonance and feedback. And Goodman uses this to kind of outline how this isn't just related to the voice or audition, but it's kind of it's where this kind of insensible underground of noise or inaudible noise is where sound, futurity and governance kind of battle out amongst themselves and shape the present through a kind of process of resonance and feedback. And also I think it's important to note that this point that he has where he bypasses this dialectic of the politics of noise and the politics of silence echoes with what Mladen Dolar says when he problematizes the straightforward relation between the voice and silence. And I think this is really important because his basic refutation of this is that, of course, there are always voices that aren't heard. And in this context of Northern Ireland, I think this is the key, because at this point, I believe that it's these excluded voices which actually become the loudest. So what I want to show to you today is kind of an example of how that happens. And like I said, this is done through TV, and I'm going to show you a clip of a TV film called Elephant, and then I'm going to speak a little bit about that as well. But one last point before I do that, which is that I want to kind of also situate this so that this first clip I'm going to show is towards the start and the end of the band. So the interactions that happen start as the band was being introduced. Later on I'll show some kind of news clips which were as the band was petering out and kind of the political landscape had shifted, and that kind of registers that on the news. So without further ado, I'm just going to go through to the next slide, which is an example of cinematic silence. So like I said, it's directed by Alan Clark, and it's a couple minutes long, so I'll speak to you after. Okay, so I don't know if you've seen Elephant before, but it's a duration of 40 minutes. I wish I could show you the whole thing because it kind of changes things quite a lot when you have to sit through all those murders. Throughout the film there's no dialogue whatsoever. And the content of this ban in Northern Ireland, which was experiencing a sectarian conflict, was that it banned anyone from these certain political organisations who might incite or imply support for violence in combination with anything, any kind of political activity. So even though this ban is really quite radical, this film rather, it escaped the ban because the terrorists didn't speak, which is kind of like almost an accidental arrangement. But for me, it kind of stands as a real indictment to the kind of the culture of refusing dialogue and discourse, which helped kind of prolong the violence in the film. So I have a couple of points on how that is achieved through the material of this kind of audiovisual thing in cinema. So this is directed by Alan Clark. He was invited by Danny Boyle, the director who you know from many other films. The initial offer of a straightforward drama was put out as an idea, but dismissed on the grounds that as two outsiders, the notion of kind of visiting the area and directing, in their words, a pseudo-important drama and getting out of there would risk making a moody thriller about personal tragedy. The director's main agenda, which he stated, was that he wanted to throw this back visually at the mainland. What he was trying to throw back visually is really the absence of any kind of dialogue or images of this kind of really intense conflict during this particular time that were on the airwaves or not on the airwaves in the UK. So the three of these kind of aspects that he manages to achieve this cinematic silence are, the first one kind of relates to movement. So there's the movement of the camera, which in this case is a wandering Steadicam, which can nominate a human subject as a cipher of evil, but by revealing simultaneously that the camera's bond with him or her as inseparable with the evil act depicted implicates us as viewers in the process, which makes for kind of uneasy watching, which is why I kind of suggest that you check it out, because it's easily accessible online. Over the course of the 40 minutes of the film and 18 murders, even this convention is blurred as the camera kind of wanders and follows victims as well as killers, so you're really left kind of disoriented. Another kind of movement is the transitions that I just spoke of there in the film, where over time you really get a sense that there isn't really any kind of logic or recuperating narrative that's going to arrive, that you're really just kind of lost in this kind of cycle of images, you know, and you kind of go through stages where you first maybe feel a bit surprised, a little bit confused, but then quickly you become bored and maybe a little bit disgusted, and kind of you begin to reflect on your own kind of gaze and your listening. So which kind of suspends us in an undefinable region of quality, which is kind of felt across the senses, where silence can be seen cinematically. And that kind of echoes what Michel Chion, the film theorist, says when he talks about audio vision being kind of like a syncretic effect, which manages to kind of to happen spontaneously as we view. The second point relates to what I would call politics of withdrawal. So the film drew criticism from some sources for its lack of context, because it kind of seems to justify the violence on screen, but I don't agree with that at all. Instead, I think Clark foregrounded how narrative structure by itself serves to justify and explain its content. Narrative smooths over in this process, which unfolds in real time, which makes for difficult viewing, as the viewer is taken on this kind of long, arduous, repetitive journey. In the envelope of this kind of deafening silence, the associations are felt, but the activity of the associations isn't necessarily. The film also drew on implications that lurk beneath their interpretation. As Stephen Gilbert's reading asserted that it is the form and analysis of these images as a discourse in its own right is where the radicalism of the film lies. I will reckon that kind of foregrounded the gap between the dominant discourse of the text and the dominant ideological discourse of the time, which existed in a climate of restricted dialogue. So there's this insensible underground of association, which I was kind of alluding to earlier on, which is where the empirical and the ideological tendencies meet, but Clark's skill as a director is creating a realistic rendering of an image that this abstract terrain where neither thing is fixed and really kind of any interpretation is viable, and this has been adapted and kind of used and influenced lots of different artists, from Willie Doherty to Gus Van Sant, who took the title of this film, Elephant. By the way, the title of the film, Elephant, refers to the phrase that Bernard McLaverty said, that the elephant is like the elephant in your living room, which is really, really hard to ignore. So it kind of summed up the politics of the time. Lastly, there's a kind of a durational effect, which is how I kind of became subjected by this film and got really into how this related to the particular period. I was reminded of the nightly news bulletins, which became so commonplace during that time. For an audience familiar with the conflict, the film can syncopate memory with its own affects, setting up a resonance and relaying a strange feedback. It has an episodic nature and the highly formal language of representation, which is drawn from the history of cinema. The film manages to occupy a point between the news media's role in reporting events and cinema as a reflection of civic space and discourse. Again, this line is ambiguous, but I believe that it was a conscious decision on the part of the directors to engage with this. This film was first broadcast at 9:50 p.m., which was right after the kind of 9 o'clock news, which I think was a pretty provocative gesture. For me, it's fascinating, not just as an example of a singular piece of cinema, but as a key to thinking through and highlighting the way in which drama, audiovisual media functioned in Northern Ireland at that time. Like I said, it made it to the airwaves just by accident, really, even though it's the kind of sharpest critique of the time. So by making silence audible, Elephant highlights the folly of shrinking the potential for a space for political discourse when it most needed it. So this is what I was saying about the kind of the meeting forces of this ban introduced at a time when the conflict was really, really tense. So I think it sums up as well how silence can be used as a productive gesture. So I want to move on to the next section, which falls in with this point I made earlier on about the silent voice of the letter and the law, and how we interpret the ban. So the ban was announced on the 19th of October 1988 in the House of Commons, which is the forum for government in London. What wasn't announced during that period was that, along with this ban on these legal organisations, which was designed to restrict a particular Republican political party, the British government also ended the right to silence in Northern Ireland. So if you were questioned, you didn't have the right to silence, and silence was then an incriminating thing. So without disclosing these details fully, this fact was an acknowledgement that the context of who was allowed to speak and where was the true goal of this kind of legislative imposition. The dual nature of this legislative method meant that all speeches and silences could be used to insinuate upon anyone whose actions were not in the interest of government. So, just to kind of go into a little bit more detail about what the ban was, it banned interviews, it banned statements and reports of quotes. So, quote-unquote terrorists weren't allowed to appear directly, but people were allowed to kind of report on events and kind of relay that message in a secondary way. What wasn't banned was Parliament and election speeches. So there was kind of like a Representation of the People Act, which protected this privilege, but really that would have been too difficult to remove. But it kind of opens up this weird space, which I think is how the ban ended up being interpreted. It wasn't fully closed. So there was a debate just 10 days before Elephant was broadcast in the House of Commons. And I feel obliged to tell you now that this next section that I'm going to present isn't through my own voice, but I've enlisted the help of two actors. So I just like, if Yaron was there. If we could pass the microphone to these two actors, which will kind of relay the message that was announced in the House of Commons.
I would like to ask the Secretary of State for the Home Department the following questions. 1. Whether his ban on broadcasting terrorist interviews covers interviews recorded more than 20 years ago. 2. Whether his ban on broadcasting terrorist interviews covers interviews recorded with persons who have since died. 3. Whether his ban on broadcasting terrorist interviews applies to archive material older than 25 years.
No time limit has been set on the use of archive material, and the restrictions may apply to the broadcasting of interviews with persons who have since died. But any statement which cannot be broadcast directly under the restrictions can still be reported and drawn upon in the course of a particular programme.
So, as the one place in this whole debate, the House of Commons, this was kind of a forum where speech was very open. But as you can see from this exchange, the answer never really engaged with it, so it allowed a very open interpretation of the ban, which led to a very interesting effect. So this leads on to the final section of the talk, which I'll show you some clips where the journalists managed to circumvent the ban during this time by getting voiceovers of employing actors rather to voice over the filmed reports. So you have this really strange arrangement which I haven't come across anywhere else. So I'm just going to show you the first clip, and these loosely kind of define what I've described as the prosthetic voice in this context. So here we go.
Demonstrators paraded through the city to the City Hall, where they were addressed by Sinn Féin politicians. The DUP leader Ian Paisley has described the rally as a recruiting parade for the IRA and an insult to Protestants. Marie Irvine reports.
Several thousand people from nationalist parts of Belfast took part in the rally, the first march in more than 2 decades by Republicans to the City Hall. A huge tricolour was raised in front of the building before the rally was addressed by Sinn Féin leaders. But today unionists were angry the march was allowed to take place at all.
In the 1930s in Germany, Hitler was a legal party. He came to power through the ballot box. Just because you're legal doesn't make it right. And the fact is that I believe the state has to differentiate between people who are genuinely going to use the democratic process to achieve their objectives and those who are using the democratic process in combination with force to achieve their objectives. And I think there is a clear distinction between those two elements.
Mr. Adams said this is his city. He said we will fly the flag of our city upon our city. I take that as a challenge, and it's not his city. It's not the city of the murderous scum of the IRA, and it's never going to be their city. There may be weak-kneed politicians in Westminster who will sell out, but the Ulster people are not going to sell out their heritage.
The Sinn Féin president, Gerry Adams, says Mr Paisley should withdraw his remarks. His words cannot be heard because of the government's broadcasting restrictions, but he said Protestants had nothing to fear from a rally like yesterday's, whereas Catholics had a lot to fear from organisations such as Ulster Resistance. The leader of the Alliance delegation on Belfast City Council says the police were right to allow them.
Okay, so I'm just going to show you one more clip as well, which is quite short.
At Belfast City Hall, because of government broadcasting restrictions, his words are voiced by an actor.
Sinn Féin stood under very difficult circumstances. Our vote has gone up right throughout this state. The trend has been where we have been able to stand, that we have received support. And in Belfast City and in this City Council, in this City Hall where I'm now standing in, which is the second largest elected assembly on this island, our voters are saying they want to move forward, not on the basis of triumphalism or of domination, but on the basis of equality. And if unions don't want to listen to that, I'm sorry, that's their hard luck. They will listen.
But in that City Council, can you really now expect Sinn Féin to be dealt with or approached in any other way than the confrontational way we've seen in the last time?
Why not? I mean, if these people are all Democrats.
As long as the IRA is bombing Belfast.
Well, Sinn Féin isn't bombing Belfast. Sinn Féin is standing in an election on a very, very clear ticket. And we have received a very, very sizable mandate. And I mean, let's not get away from the reality of this situation. That the SDLP, who are our closest opponents in this election, have been devastated by the votes that were in the Western cities.
Okay, so just a quick note about those two clips. They kind of link together because it shows at the start that there was different ways that the voiceovers could be used, and then in this very strange way we had a direct kind of actor where kind of the fictional and the kind of documentary modes kind of meet. So the first clip kind of registers on screen like a different kind of forum for political speech. And this kind of harks back to kind of allegorical theories. And Gordon Teskey has an interesting reading on this, which he says that the forum isn't just a physical clearing, but it's kind of a space that's maintained by two contrasting forces, which is one where the bodies are kind of accumulated and separated by speech in two different ways. So there's kind of a corporeal, kind of manifolded space, which I think kind of Mladen Dolar is trying to get at as well with his writing, and kind of parts of these are kind of closed off when hierarchy of voices manages to kind of speak for us, kind of the mute bodies on screen. So yeah, you can see it's a very strange kind of effect, whereby a certain class of political opinions isn't allowed to be broadcast. And I just have one very last clip, which relates to how, in terms of this jurisdiction, later on this figure, Gerry Adams, was able to travel outside, and he was speaking outside the jurisdiction of the ban, but this clip shows how this was relayed to the public within that time, and this is just before the ban ended.
If Gerry Adams' main aim in coming to the United States was to get his Irish Republican message across, he's certainly succeeding.
Welcome to Larry King Live.
Gerry Adams in New York is our guest tonight.
Since 1983, the president of Sinn Fein has been Gerry Adams.
The main New York daily newspapers, too, see the Adams visit as one of the main events of the day. For the Sinn Fein leader, his message is simple. He wants peace. The British government appears not to. In America, viewers can hear Mr. Adams' voice. Due to British government broadcasting restrictions, his words here are spoken by an actor.
In May of last year, the IRA agreed to suspend its campaign for 2 weeks, and that was conveyed to the British government at that time. Here we had a historic opportunity, Irish Republicans sitting down with British government representatives to talk our way out of a conflict, and the IRA enhancing and assisting that process by suspending its armed actions, and they walked away from that situation.
Mr. Adams is this afternoon being enthusiastically welcomed by local politicians here in a New York.
Okay, so that's just like a brief kind of introduction into some of these kind of meeting places, but I've run over a couple of minutes, so sorry about that, but I hope you enjoyed that, but like I said, I'll be sticking around, so if anyone has any questions, then I'll be happy to answer them. So cheers, thanks very much.